The rain came down like judgment, cold, relentless. The kind of November rain that soaked through cheap jackets and reminded you that winter was coming, whether you were ready or not. Garrett Morrison wasn't ready. He sat alone in the back booth of Rosie's Diner, shoulders hunched, hands wrapped around a coffee cup he didn't want. The ceramic was chipped. The coffee was burnt. Neither bothered him. At 38 years old, Garrett had stopped expecting things to be perfect. He'd stopped expecting much of anything. The diner smelled like grease and exhaustion. Neon lights outside bled red and blue through rain-streaked windows, painting everything in sick, trembling colors. A trucker sat 3 booths down staring at his phone. An elderly couple picked at pancakes they'd probably ordered an hour ago. The cook moved behind the counter like a ghost flipping burgers nobody would remember eating. Garrett's hair was cropped military short, dark brown, streaked with premature gray at the temples. His beard was trimmed close neat despite everything else falling apart. A small scar cut through his right eyebrow, pale against tan skin. He looked like what he was, a man carved by hard choices and harder memories. Strong jaw, narrow eyes that watched everything and trusted nothing. Calloused hands that had held rifles, held his dying wife, held the barrel of a gun to his own head 2 years ago on a dark Idaho roadside. Beneath the table, stretched carefully so he didn't block the narrow aisle, lay Titan. Titan was a German shepherd, 8 years old. 75 pounds of black and tan fur, dulled slightly by age and the kind of life that left marks. His ears stood alert even when he rested, one notched at the tip from some fight or accident before Garrett found him. Amber eyes tracked movement with the focus of an animal that had learned to watch for danger. A scar ran across his muzzle, pale and jagged. His left hind leg bore a slight hitch when he walked, a reminder of the beating that had nearly killed him before Garrett pulled over on that Idaho highway 5 years ago. Titan wasn't a pet. He was a partner. The kind forged not in kennels or training facilities, but in desperation. The kind that saved your life by simply refusing to leave. Garrett's hands ached. 12 hours fixing industrial freezer units in a warehouse that smelled like rotting produce and diesel fumes. $16 an hour. Before that, 6 hours unloading delivery trucks for $14 an hour. The math never worked. It never had. Rent $840. Disability pension $1,847. Credit card minimum payments for Sarah's medical bills, $412. Groceries for him and Titan, $200 if he stretched it. Gas, electric. The vet bill from 3 months ago, when Titan ate something that damn near killed him. $51,340 in debt, all from trying to save a woman who couldn't be saved. Garrett didn't blame Sarah. Ovarian cancer didn't ask permission. Didn't care that they had plans. Didn't care that she was only 34 with red hair and freckles and a laugh that made him believe the world wasn't entirely broken. She died in 2022, September 14th. Garrett remembered because he'd stopped remembering much else after that. He looked down at his coffee, saw his reflection in the dark surface, didn't recognize the man staring back. That was when the noise changed. The laughter came from the corner booth near the back exit, loud, sharp, the kind that cut through conversation and demanded attention. 2 men, mid-30s, broad-shouldered and red-faced from alcohol. One wore an expensive vest over a button-down shirt that probably cost more than Garrett made in a week. Dark hair slicked back, clean-shaven, smug smile that spoke of money and immunity. The other was bulkier, bald head, thick neck, gold chain. Leather jacket thrown carelessly on the seat beside him. Between their table and the kitchen stood a young woman, Grace Sullivan, 22 years old, though she looked younger. Average height, maybe 5'5". Slim build, pale skin that flushed too easily. Long blonde hair pulled into a ponytail that kept slipping loose as she moved. Her uniform didn't fit right, sleeves a little too long. Apron tied unevenly, she had striking blue eyes. The kind that wanted to see the best in people, even when people made it hard. Right now, those eyes were wide with fear. The man in the vest, Blake Harlow, reached across the table and caught her wrist. Not hard enough to bruise, not yet, but tight enough to make a point. His voice dropped low, mocking, words soaked in entitlement that Garrett couldn't quite hear, but could absolutely understand. Grace tried to pull away. Blake held tighter. The bald man laughed, leaned back, blocked the narrow path to the kitchen without touching her at all. The diner went quiet in the way places do when everyone pretends not to see. The elderly couple studied their pancakes with sudden intensity. The trucker's thumb moved across his phone screen, eyes locked anywhere but the corner booth. Even the cook paused, spatula hovering over the grill face, frozen in the calculation of whether stepping in would cost him his job. Garrett saw it all. His jaw tightened. Years of training cataloged distances, exits, angles. He knew exactly how fast this could turn, knew the weight of intervention, knew what it could cost him. One wrong move, one accusation, one call to the police that went sideways. Two jobs, an apartment that tolerated Titan because Garrett paid on time. A fragile routine held together with duct tape and willpower. All of it could collapse. He told himself it wasn't his responsibility, that someone else would step in, that the girl would find a way out on her own. Garrett looked down at his coffee, tried to make himself small, invisible. Beneath the table, Titan's body went rigid. The change was immediate, ears fully erect, breathing shallow and controlled, every muscle beneath the thick fur quietly engaging. His amber eyes locked onto the corner booth with laser focus. He didn't bark, didn't move. Then slowly, deliberately, Titan growled. It started low in his chest. A rumble that vibrated through the floor, through the table legs, straight into Garrett's ribs. Not a threat, a warning, ancient, unmistakable. The sound a wolf makes when it smells fire. Garrett froze. He knew that sound, had heard it exactly twice before. Once in Iraq 30 seconds before an IED detonated. Once on the Idaho roadside when Titan found him with a 9mm in his hand and death in his eyes. That growl wasn't about anger. It was about recognition. Danger, here. Now, Garrett exhaled, long and tired, pushed himself out of the booth. Chairs scraped, a few heads turned. Garrett Morrison stood 5'11", not tall, not imposing, just a man in worn jeans and a faded hoodie, hands loose at his sides, posture carefully non-confrontational. But his eyes were different now, flat, focused, the eyes of someone who'd walked into rooms where people died and walked out alive. He moved toward the corner booth, each step measured, deliberate. Blake Harlow didn't notice at first, too busy enjoying the fear in Grace's face. Garrett stopped 3 feet away. His voice came out quiet, steady, carrying just enough weight to be heard over the rain drumming against the windows. Let her go. Blake's head snapped up, eyes narrowed. He took in Garrett with a single dismissive glance, saw the cheap clothes, the worn boots, the man who didn't matter. Mind your business, old man. Garrett didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there with the kind of stillness that made predators nervous. Blake released Grace's wrist, stood up slowly. He had 3 inches on Garrett, maybe 40 pounds. Expensive clothes and the arrogance that came with money his father gave him. You got a problem. Blake stepped closer, alcohol thick on his breath. You know who I am? No, and Garrett's voice stayed level. Don't care. The bald man stood up too, flanking, classic intimidation. Garrett's peripheral vision tracked both of them without looking away from Blake. Blake smiled, cold, cruel. You should care. He grabbed Garrett's collar, yanked him forward. The diner held its breath. Behind Garrett, Titan rose to his feet. The growl deepened, changed, became something more than warning. The sound carried authority. Promise. The voice of a creature that had survived beatings and starvation and abandonment and come out the other side with teeth intact. Titan stood 75 pounds of coiled muscle and absolute loyalty. His coat bristled along the spine, but he didn't lunge, didn't bare teeth. Just stood there, positioned between his human and danger, waiting for the signal that meant now. Blake's eyes flicked to the dog, back to Garrett. Something flickered in his expression. Not quite fear, not quite recognition, but close. Last chance, Garrett said quietly. Let go. Blake shoved him instead. Garrett stumbled back, caught his balance against the edge of a booth. Pain flared in his shoulder where the fabric pulled tight. His hearing aid whined briefly in his right ear, the one that barely worked anymore after the IED in Ramadi took most of his hearing and killed 3 better men. The bald man moved in from the side, thrown a wide, sloppy punch fueled by alcohol and bad judgment. Garrett didn't think. Training took over. Muscle memory, carved by years in SEAL Team 5, honed in places where hesitation meant dying. He deflected the punch, turned his shoulder, used the man's momentum against him, stepped close, controlled the space, pushed him off balance into a table. Silverware clattered. Someone screamed. Blake lunged, faster than his drunk friend, meaner. Garrett pivoted, caught Blake's wrist mid-swing, applied pressure to the nerve cluster. Blake's hand spasmed open. Garrett swept his leg. Blake went down hard on the wet tile floor, head cracking against the booth's edge with a sound like a bat hitting a melon. He didn't get up. The bald man scrambled to his feet, took one look at Garrett's eyes, at Titan's bared teeth, at Blake's unconscious body, ran. The bell over the door chimed as he fled into the rain. Silence crashed down like a wave. Garrett stood there, breathing hard, hands shaking with adrenaline he didn't want and couldn't control. His shoulder throbbed. His heart hammered against ribs that remembered what panic felt like. This was exactly what he'd feared. Grace slid down against the counter, knees giving way. Her hands covered her mouth. Tears spilled freely, carving tracks through cheap makeup. Garrett wanted to tell her it was over, that she was safe, but he didn't trust his voice. Didn't trust anything right now, except the warm weight of Titan pressing against his leg, grounding him to the world. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Chow! The police arrived in pairs. 2 squad cars, lights painting the diner in strobing blue and red. Officer Sarah Davies entered firsthand, resting casually near her belt. 42 years old, 15 years on the force. Steel gray hair pulled into a tight bun beneath her cap. Face lined not by age but by measured restraint. She scanned the room quickly. Took in Blake Harlow groaning on the floor, blood trickling from his hairline. Took in Garrett standing quietly, hands visible, breathing controlled. Took in Titan seated at his handler's side, pressed close enough that Garrett could feel the heat of him. What happened? Sarah's voice was firm, professional, not cruel. Everyone spoke at once, the cook, the trucker, the elderly couple. Grace, for the first time that night, the silence broke in Garrett's favor. Stories overlapped but aligned, pointed to the same truth. The girl had been grabbed. The dog's owner intervened. Blake Harlow threw the first punch. Sarah pulled up security footage on the small monitor behind the counter. Watched without expression, arms folded as the scene replayed in grainy black and white. Garrett stood quietly. Titan sat at his side. He didn't interrupt, didn't justify. The truth didn't need embellishment. Either the camera saw it or it didn't. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah turned to him. Her gaze softened. Not sympathy, recognition. "You're not under arrest," she said. "You acted to stop an assault." Garrett released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. 2 paramedics loaded Blake onto a stretcher. He was conscious now, slurring threats through a split lip and broken nose. Promising lawsuits. Promising his father would destroy everyone in this shithole diner. Sarah followed them out, returned 5 minutes later with a card. "You'll need to come in tomorrow, give a formal statement." She handed him the card. "But you did the right thing." Garrett took the card, nodded once. As the door closed behind the ambulance, the diner exhaled collectively. The danger had passed, but its echo lingered, hung in the air like smoke. Grace approached Garrett hesitantly. Up close, he noticed her eyes were red from crying. Her hands were raw from constant washing. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, unsure what words could possibly cover what had just happened. "Thank you," she managed finally, voice barely above a whisper. Garrett nodded. "Take care of yourself." He turned to leave. "Wait," Grace's voice stopped him. "What's your name?" "Garrett Morrison." "I'm Grace, Grace Sullivan." She extended a trembling hand. Garrett shook it briefly. Her grip was weak, uncertain. The handshake of someone still figuring out who they were. "You should go home, Grace. It's late." "I don't know how to thank you properly." "You don't owe me anything." Garrett's voice was flat, final. He'd learned a long time ago that gratitude didn't pay rent, didn't fix what was broken. He walked toward the door. Titan fell into step beside him, close enough that Garrett could feel the slight hitch in his gait, the age settling into joints that had carried too much for too long. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. The air tasted like wet asphalt and ozone. Garrett's truck sat in the lot. A 2008 Ford F-150 with rust eating the wheel wells and a cracked windshield he couldn't afford to replace. He opened the door. Titan jumped in first, settling on the bench seat with a soft grunt. Garrett climbed in after him, sat there for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. His phone buzzed. Text from the warehouse. "Where are you?" Night shift started 20 minutes ago. He was late, which meant dock pay, which meant falling further behind on the credit card that charged 24% interest on Sarah's final hospital bills. Garrett closed his eyes, pressed his forehead against the steering wheel. Titan shifted, placed his head on Garrett's thigh. Warm, solid, real. "We're okay, boy," Garrett whispered. "We're okay." He didn't believe it, but saying it out loud made the lie easier to carry. Garrett started the truck. The engine coughed twice before catching. He pulled out of the lot, wipers squeaking against glass, and drove through Cedar Falls toward another shift he couldn't afford to miss. Behind him, Grace Sullivan stood at the diner window watching his taillights disappear into the rain. She pulled out her phone, hesitated, then dialed. 3 rings. A woman's voice crisp and professional, even at midnight. Grace, it's late. Mom, Grace's voice cracked. Something happened tonight. I'm okay, but I need to tell you the truth. A pause. Then what truth? About where I've been working for the past 3 months. Another pause. Longer. When Margaret Sullivan spoke again, her voice carried the weight of a woman who'd built an empire by knowing when to listen. Tell me everything. Morning came gray and reluctant. Low clouds pressed down on the industrial district where Garrett Morrison spent his days repairing failing freezer units. The hum of machinery usually soothed him. Today it only sharpened the unease sitting heavy in his chest. He'd gotten 3 hours of sleep. Maybe. The nightmares were worse when he was exhausted. Last night, Ramadi, the IED, Lieutenant Patterson's body in pieces. The ringing in Garrett's ears that never really stopped. He worked methodically now, hands steady despite the noise in his head. Replaced compressor valves. Checked refrigerant levels. Made notes in a battered spiral notebook because the foreman didn't trust digital anything. His shoulder ached where Blake had grabbed him. His knuckles were scraped from when he'd caught himself against the booth. Small prices. He'd paid worse. Titan waited near the loading dock, lying on cold concrete with his paws crossed neatly in front of him. In daylight, his age showed more clearly. Gray dusted his muzzle like frost. There was stiffness when he shifted positions. 8 years old was ancient for a dog who'd survived what Titan survived, but his eyes remained alert, watchful. Every few minutes he lifted his head to track footsteps, then settled again, reassured by Garrett's presence. Just before noon, a man Garrett barely recognized approached him. Thin, balding, nervous habit of adjusting wireframe glasses. Company jacket too clean for the warehouse floor. Management. Middle management. Morrison. The man cleared his throat. You're needed in the front office. Garrett's stomach dropped. Here it was, the call he'd been expecting since last night. Somebody complained. Somebody made a phone call. Somebody with money and lawyers decided Garrett Morrison was a liability. He shut down the unit he was working on, wiped his hands on a rag, followed. Titan rose immediately. Fell into step beside him close enough that Garrett could feel the warmth of his shoulder against his leg. The front office was small, windowless, smelled faintly of old paper and industrial strength cleaner. 2 chairs faced a cheap desk. One was empty. The other was occupied by a woman who looked like she'd never asked permission to exist in a room. Margaret Sullivan was 58 years old, tall, straight-backed. Silver blonde hair cut into a precise bob that framed her face without softening it. Her suit was charcoal gray, tailored to perfection. Understated but unmistakably expensive. Fine lines traced the corners of her eyes. Not from worry, from years of deliberate control. When she stood to greet him, her movements were economical, practiced. Mr. Morrison, she extended her hand. Thank you for coming. Her grip was firm, cool, the handshake of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Garrett shook briefly, noticed how her eyes flicked to Titan, not with fear or distaste, but with focused curiosity, assessing. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Diners. The words settled slowly. Meridian, the diner, the chain. 47 locations across Oregon, Washington, Idaho. Annual revenue in the 100 million range. Garrett didn't respond. Silence often revealed more than questions. Margaret gestured to the chair. Please sit. Garrett sat. Titan lowered himself at his feet, posture alert but relaxed. Margaret took her seat again, folded her hands neatly on the desk. For a moment, she studied Garrett openly, as if assembling a picture from pieces she already possessed. I reviewed the incident from last night, she said. Security footage, police report, witness statements. Garrett's jaw tightened. I didn't start anything. I know. Margaret's voice stayed even. That's not why you're here. She paused. Something shifted in her expression. Not weakness. Something closer to restraint being tested. The young woman working the floor last night. Margaret chose her words carefully. Her name is Grace Sullivan. She's my daughter. The silence that followed was absolute. Garrett sat very still. Years ago, that revelation might have rattled him, might have sparked defensiveness or anger. Now it simply landed with weight. Pieces rearranged themselves in his mind. The girl's nervous politeness. The way she kept apologizing. The lack of entitlement in her voice. She'd been hiding. Margaret exhaled slowly. Grace asked to work at the smallest, least profitable location in our system. She didn't want my name attached. She wanted to understand what it meant to stand where our most vulnerable employees stand. Garrett absorbed this without comment. She didn't tell me where she was working, Margaret continued. She didn't tell me she was afraid. Her gaze dropped to her folded hands. When she looked up again, the steel hadn't vanished, but it had bent. I built Meridian from nothing, Mr. Morrison. I tell myself I know this business. I tell myself policies and procedures are enough. Her mouth tightened. Last night proved me wrong. Garrett shifted in his chair. I didn't know who she was. I'm grateful for that, Margaret replied. If you had, I suspect you might have hesitated. That was true. Garrett didn't deny it. Margaret leaned back slightly. My daughter believed that dignity came from enduring hardship quietly. I believe the system protected people who followed the rules. She paused. We were both mistaken. She reached into a leather portfolio and withdrew a tablet, slid it across the desk. On the screen was paused footage from the diner camera. Garrett standing between Grace and the men, Titan braced behind him, every muscle coiled and ready. You didn't escalate, Margaret said. You didn't retreat. You recognized danger before it became irreversible. She met his eyes directly. That's not something that can be taught in a training seminar. Garrett stared at the image. Discomfort stirred in his chest. He'd never liked seeing himself from the outside. Never liked being reminded of what he was capable of. What do you want? He asked. Margaret's lips curved faintly. Not a smile. Respect. I want you to help me fix what I failed to see. She pulled up another document on the tablet. Incident reports. Dates. Locations. Names redacted, but patterns clear. Meridian has dozens of locations like Rosie's. Places where staff work late, alone, overlooked. Places where policy means little without presence. She slid the tablet closer. I want you to help design and oversee real-world safety response, starting from the bottom, the places no one audits because they aren't profitable enough to matter. Garrett felt something tighten in his chest. I'm not management material. No, Margaret agreed. You're better. She glanced down briefly at Titan. Your dog. Garrett stiffened instinctively. Titan is part of how you assess risk, Margaret continued. I've already consulted with our legal team. With proper certification, he can be officially recognized as a security support animal within our properties. Garrett said nothing. His throat felt unexpectedly tight. Titan had saved his life, not once, every single day for 5 years. This is not charity, Margaret said, anticipating the objection. And it is not an apology disguised as opportunity. It is a correction. One I am responsible for. She slid a business card across the desk. Heavy stock, simple design, just her name, title, and direct line. The position comes with a salary of $68,000 annually, full benefits, health insurance that will cover your existing debts from your wife's medical care. Garrett's breath caught. $68,000. That was more than he'd made in 2 years combined. Take 24 hours, Margaret said. If you say no, nothing changes. You walk out of here and we never speak again. She paused. If you say yes, then what happened last night becomes more than a near tragedy. Garrett stood slowly. Titan rose with him, pressing close. For a brief moment, Garrett looked at Margaret, not as a CEO, but as a mother who had come dangerously close to learning a lesson too late. I'll think about it, he said. Margaret nodded. That's all I ask. As Garrett left the office warehouse, noise resumed around him. Forklifts, compressors, men shouting over machinery, unchanged. Yet the world felt subtly off balance, as if a door had opened that could not be closed again. Titan glanced up at him as they walked. Eyes steady, trusting. No growl, no warning, just presence. Garrett pulled out the business card, ran his thumb over the embossed letters. Margaret Sullivan, Chief Executive Officer. $68,000. Health insurance. A chance to do something that mattered. Or a chance to fail spectacularly and lose what little stability he'd clawed back. He thought about Grace Sullivan, 22 years old and terrified, trapped between two drunk men who thought power meant they could take what they wanted. He thought about Sarah, how she'd fought for 2 years, how he'd fought beside her, how they'd lost anyway. He thought about the gun in his hand on that Idaho roadside, the cold metal, the finality. And he thought about Titan, 75 pounds of scarred, limping, absolutely unshakable loyalty, the dog who'd walked out of the darkness and refused to let Garrett disappear into it. Garrett put the card in his pocket. That evening, the rain returned. Garrett's apartment was small, 1 bedroom, low ceilings, paint the color of old paper. But it was clean, orderly, quiet. A single lamp warmed the corners near the window. Outside, Cedar Falls exhaled into dusk, engines humming, doors closing, lives moving forward without him. Garrett sat at the narrow kitchen table. Margaret's business card lay flat before him. Thick stock, expensive without advertising itself. Her name, title, and number printed in clean black letters. Nothing else. No promise, no explanation. Just a door left ajar. Titan lay nearby on the worn rug. Long body stretched out, head lifted, ears relaxed. In the soft light, the silver at his muzzle was more pronounced. Gentle Frost that time had laid there without asking. He was 8 now, maybe closer to 9. The years had slowed him just enough to make each movement thoughtful. When he rose carefully. When he watched deeply. Garrett poured himself a glass of water, leaned against the counter. The ache in his shoulders settled in like an old friend. He'd known offers before, contracts, deployments, promises wrapped in urgency and the American flag. This felt different. There was no pressure, no deadline beyond the simple courtesy of time, and that unsettled him more than any command ever had. He thought about the diner, not the violence, but the space around it, the silence that had come before, the way people had chosen stillness over risk. He'd spent years training himself to move toward danger. After leaving the service after Sarah, he'd spent just as long training himself to do the opposite. Survival had required that shift. So had keeping Titan alive. He remembered the night he'd found the dog. Idaho, Highway 55, 3 in the morning. Garrett had been driving aimlessly for 6 hours, gun in the passenger seat, trying to find the courage to pull over and end it. Titan had been lying in the ditch, ribs showing through matted fur, eyes sharp with distrust, collar embedded in his neck from years of neglect. Garrett had stopped the truck, not to help, just because he'd run out of road. The dog had looked at him, just looked, and something in those amber eyes had asked a question Garrett wasn't ready to answer. He'd taken Titan to an emergency vet, spent $1,100 he didn't have, brought him home, fed him, bathed him, waited. It took weeks before Titan slept without flinching, months before he accepted a hand near his neck. Trust, Garrett learned, was not granted by words. It was built by consistency, by staying. Garrett rubbed his face with both hands, let out a breath. "What do you think, old man?" he murmured. Titan's tail thumped once against the rug. He rose, slowly crossed the room, and placed his head against Garrett's thigh. The contact was gentle, deliberate. No urgency, no demand. Garrett closed his eyes, felt the weight of the dog's trust, the responsibility of it. He thought about Grace Sullivan, Margaret Sullivan, the women trying to fix something broken in different ways. He thought about the 47 diners, the late shifts, the vulnerable employees working alone in places no one important ever visited. He thought about Sarah, how she'd made him promise in those final weeks that he'd keep living, that he'd find purpose again. "I'm trying, Sarah," he whispered to the empty apartment. "I'm trying." Later that night, Garrett dreamed. Long corridors, fluorescent lights, doors lining the walls, some locked, some ajar. Behind one, he heard Grace's voice, unsteady but determined. Behind another, the low echo of Titan's growl. Steady as a heartbeat, he walked toward them. But the corridor stretched, lengthened. No matter how far he walked, the doors stayed just out of reach. He woke before he reached either one. Chest tight, hands clenched. The apartment was dark. Titan lay beside the bed where he always slept, eyes open, watching. "Yeah," Garrett said to the darkness. "I know." Morning came clear and cold, sky pale blue and unforgiving. Garrett took Titan out early, walked the neighborhood while the world was still quiet. Noticed the way Titan favored his left hind leg, just slightly, a stiffness Garrett had learned to read. Nothing urgent, just time doing what time did best. They returned to the apartment. Garrett made coffee, black, strong. He picked up his phone, stared at it for a full minute. Then he called the number on the card. Margaret Sullivan answered on the second ring. There was no surprise in her voice when she heard his name, as if she'd been expecting this. "I'll accept," Garrett said simply. "On one condition." "I'm listening." "I start where it's worst. The small places, the late shifts, the ones people forget." He paused. "And Titan stays with me." There was silence, brief, thoughtful. "Agreed," Margaret said. "Both." They set the meeting for the following morning. Meridian's referral office. Portland, 8 a.m. Garrett hung up, set the phone down, looked at Titan. The dog looked back, amber eyes clear, trusting. "Well," Garrett said, "I guess we're doing this." Titan's tail wagged, once, twice. For the first time in 2 years, Garrett Morrison smiled. Not much, just enough. The Meridian Regional Office sat on the 8th floor of a glass tower in downtown Portland. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Willamette River where morning fog still clung to the water like regret. Garrett Morrison arrived 15 minutes early. Old habits. In the SEALs, early meant on time. On time meant late. He wore the only button-down shirt he owned. Blue. Wrinkled despite his best efforts with an iron that barely worked. His jeans were clean, but worn at the knees. Boots scuffed beyond salvation. He looked exactly like what he was, a working man in a world built for people who'd never worked with their hands. Titan walked beside him, leash loose, posture composed. The dog's nails clicked softly on polished marble floors that probably cost more than Garrett's truck. A receptionist looked up, young, professional. Her smile faltered slightly when she saw Titan, then recovered with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Morrison." "Yes, ma'am." "Miss Sullivan is expecting you. Conference room C. I'll escort you." They rode the elevator in silence. Soft music played, something classical that Garrett didn't recognize. The receptionist stood carefully on the opposite side, giving Titan space. The elevator doors opened onto a hallway lined with photographs. Diners, employees, families eating breakfast. The American dream in bacon and eggs. Conference room C overlooked the river. Sunlight filtered through the windows, catching dust motes in the air. Margaret Sullivan stood beside the window, speaking quietly with another woman. She turned when Garrett entered. "Mr. Morrison, thank you for coming." Margaret's handshake was just as firm as yesterday. "This is Helen Montgomery, our Chief Operating Officer." Helen Montgomery was 49 years old. Tall and lean with short auburn hair cut close to the jaw. Her skin was weathered in the way of someone who spent more time on factory floors than behind desks. Sharp eyes that assessed without judgment. When she shook Garrett's hand, her grip was firm, practical, the handshake of someone who understood work. "I've read your file," Helen said. "Both parts of it." Garrett inclined his head. He appreciated honesty without embellishment. The DD-214 discharge papers, 8 years in the Navy. SEAL Team 5, 3 tours in Iraq. Combat Action Ribbon, Bronze Star with Valor, medical discharge for hearing loss and traumatic brain injury. And the other part, the credit report. The eviction notices before he found the current apartment. The gap in employment after Sarah died. The psychiatric hold at the VA hospital in Boise after a concerned neighbor called 911. Both parts made him who he was. They sat. Coffee was poured. The room hummed softly with restrained efficiency. Margaret spoke first. She outlined the position in plain terms. No corporate language, no buzzwords, just facts. Garrett would oversee safety assessments and response training, beginning with Meridian's least profitable locations, the diners in small towns, along highways, the ones that barely broke even but employed people who needed the work. He would work directly with staff, not just managers. He would be empowered to change procedures that didn't work in real conditions. And Titan, Margaret added, will be formally certified as a security support animal across our properties. Garrett glanced down at the dog. Titan sat calmly at his feet, eyes half-lidded, unbothered by titles or corporate speak. Helen slid a folder across the table. Manila, thick. "These are incident reports from the last 5 years, she said. Harassment, threats, physical assaults that didn't make headlines because the victims were too afraid to press charges or needed their jobs more than they needed justice." Garrett opened the folder, started reading. His expression tightened with each page. Server followed to her car. Twice. Management told her to park closer to the building. Cook threatened with a knife by a drunk customer. Police called. No charges filed. Customer was a county commissioner. Night manager locked himself and 2 teenage employees in the office for 40 minutes while men pounded on the door. No incident report filed. Manager quit the next week. 27 incidents in 3 years. Different locations. Different victims. Same pattern. People with power taking what they wanted from people with none. "You won't fix everything," Helen said quietly, "but you'll make it harder for people to be ignored." Garrett looked up from the papers, held her gaze. "That's the point," he said. Margaret watched him carefully. "This role comes with stability, Mr. Morrison. A living wage, daytime hours, benefits that will clear your existing debts." "I know." "It matters," Margaret said. "I won't pretend it doesn't." "It does," Garrett replied. He didn't hide it. Money mattered when you'd spent 2 years drowning in medical bills for a woman you couldn't save. They discussed logistics, training timelines, certification processes for Titan. Garrett asked questions. Direct, unpolished, necessary. Margaret answered without deflection. Helen added details where needed. Practical, grounded. At the end of the meeting, Margaret stood and extended her hand again. Welcome to Meridian, Mr. Morrison. Garrett shook it, felt the finality of the moment settle in. As he left the building, Titan trotted beside him, posture easy. Outside Portland moved as it always had. Cars passed, people hurried. But for Garrett, the air felt different. Lighter, sharper, edged with something he hadn't allowed himself to name in years. Hope. The first location was a 2-hour drive south along the coast, Highway 101. Ocean on the left, forest on the right. The kind of road that made you believe America was still beautiful if you squinted past the strip malls and tourist traps. Coastal Highway Diner sat in Astoria wedged between a bait shop and a motel that advertised weekly rates. The building was old, 1950s architecture with aluminum siding and a neon sign that only half worked. Garrett pulled into the parking lot at 4 in the afternoon. The lot was nearly empty. 2 cars, both old enough to have stories. Inside the diner smelled like coffee and fish. Linoleum floors worn smooth in the traffic patterns. Red vinyl booths patched with duct tape. A counter with 8 stools, 3 of them occupied. Marcus O'Brien stood behind the counter, 54 years old. Broad-shouldered, with graying hair and the slight accent of someone who'd left Ireland young, but never entirely left it behind. His hands were folded behind his back, posture, military straight. He looked up when Garrett entered. Eyes went to Titan immediately, not with fear, with recognition. "You must be Morrison," Marcus said. His voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen things he didn't talk about. "Yes, sir." "Helen called, said you were coming." Marcus glanced at the dog. "That's Titan, yes, sir." Marcus came around the counter, extended his hand. "Marcus O'Brien, ran this place for 6 years. They shook. Marcus's grip was strong, calloused. The hands of someone who'd worked for every dollar. Marcus crouched down slowly, knee joints popping. Looked at Titan eye to eye. Titan sat perfectly still, assessing. "You're a good boy, aren't you?" Marcus said softly. Titan's ears perked forward. Marcus stood back up, looked at Garrett. "You prior service, Navy, SEALs, Army, Rangers, 22 years. Marcus's expression shifted, the subtle change that happened when veterans recognized each other. "Iraq, 3 tours. Afghanistan, 2. Marcus gestured to a booth. "Coffee, please." They sat. Marcus poured coffee from a pot that had been sitting too long. It was bitter and thick. Garrett drank it anyway. "Helen said you're here about safety protocols," Marcus began. "I'm here to listen," Garrett corrected. "You've been doing this job for 6 years. You know what works and what doesn't." Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded. 2 years ago," Marcus said. 3 men came in at closing, 11:30 at night, drunk, aggressive. I had 2 employees, both girls, 17 and 19. He paused, stared into his coffee. The men wouldn't leave, started making comments, touching. I stepped in. They escalated. I locked myself and the girls in the office, called 911. Took 20 minutes for deputies to arrive. Marcus's jaw tightened. We sat in that office listening to them destroy the dining room, threw chairs through windows, smashed the register. The girls were crying. I had a Louisville Slugger and a prayer. Garrett listened without interrupting. When the cops finally came, the men ran. Never caught them, never filed charges because the girls were too afraid. Didn't want their parents to know they'd been working that late. Marcus looked up. I didn't file an incident report. Didn't want corporate thinking I couldn't handle it. Fixed the windows myself, paid out of pocket. Garrett set down his coffee cup. You did the right thing protecting those girls. Did I? Marcus's voice was hollow. Or did I just teach them that's how the world works, that men like that get away with it? Both, Garrett said quietly. You kept them alive. That's what mattered in the moment. Marcus exhaled, long and tired. Garrett pulled out a notebook, cheap spiral bound from the dollar store. Tell me about your current setup. Cameras, lighting, staff schedules, everything. They talked for 2 hours. Garrett learned that the panic button behind the counter hadn't worked in 8 months, that the parking lot lights were on timers that failed half the time, that employees closing alone was standard procedure because labor costs had to be kept under 15% of revenue. Garrett took notes, asked questions, walked the parking lot with Marcus as the sun set over the Pacific. He noticed the blind spots, the broken fence at the back where someone could slip through, the dumpster positioned to block sight lines from the road. We're going to fix this, Garrett said. Marcus looked skeptical. Corporate doesn't spend money on locations like this. We're barely profitable. Corporate just hired me to spend money on locations like this, Garrett replied. That's why I'm here. Over the next 3 weeks, Garrett drove the coast, visited 12 diners, met 12 managers who all had stories they'd never told. In Coos Bay, a night cook named Thomas showed him the knife he kept under the prep counter, just in case. In Newport, a server named Lily Henderson confessed she'd been followed to her car twice, 26 years old with red hair and green eyes that had seen too much. Management told her to be more careful about accepting tips from certain customers. In Florence, Garrett found a diner where the back door lock was broken, had been broken for 5 months. Manager kept a chair wedged under the handle at night. Everywhere he went, Garrett saw the same thing. People trying to survive in a system that had forgotten them. He started making changes. Small ones at first. Functional. Working panic buttons installed at every register. Direct line to local police, not corporate security. Parking lot lighting upgraded. Motion sensors. Coverage of every vehicle. Mandatory buddy system after 10 p.m. No one closed alone. Ever. Weekly check-ins with each location. Not corporate speak. Real conversations. And everywhere Garrett went, Titan came with him. The dog became something of a legend. Employees started calling him the shepherd. Kids asked to pet him. Titan tolerated it with patient dignity. But more importantly, Titan's presence changed the atmosphere. Made people feel safer. Made would-be troublemakers think twice. A 75-pound German shepherd with scars and knowing eyes had a way of encouraging better behavior. It was during a routine visit to the Portland Central Distribution Hub that Garrett found it. He'd been reviewing shipping manifests. Part of understanding safety meant understanding operations, supply chains, delivery schedules. That's when he noticed the pattern. Harlow Logistics handled deliveries for 34 of Meridian's 47 locations. Not unusual. Consolidation made sense. Better rates. But there was something else. Special deliveries. Marked with a red flag in the system. Arriving between 2 and 4 a.m. No standard manifests. Signed for by BH or DH. Never by the regular receiving staff. Garrett pulled up the locations receiving these deliveries. Small towns, rural highways, the kind of places where people didn't ask questions. He pulled up dates, cross-referenced them with employee records. 8 employees had quit without notice in the past 2 years. All from locations receiving red flag deliveries. All within a week of a delivery date. Garrett's hands stilled on the keyboard. This wasn't random. He called Helen Montgomery, asked for a meeting, didn't explain over the phone. They met at a coffee shop in Portland. Neutral ground. Helen arrived with Margaret Sullivan. Garrett showed them the shipping logs, the employee departures, the pattern he'd found. Margaret's face went pale. Harlow Logistics, she said slowly. Dominic Harlow is on our advisory board. Who's Dominic Harlow? Garrett asked. Helen pulled up a file on her tablet, showed him a photograph. Dominic Harlow, 61 years old, silver hair, expensive suit, distinguished features, the kind of man who looked like success. He approached us 5 years ago, Margaret explained. Offered preferential shipping rates in exchange for a seat on the advisory board. Said it would help him understand the restaurant business better. How much of the company does he own? Garrett asked. Margaret and Helen exchanged a look. 15%, Margaret said quietly, through a holding company. We didn't know until the lawyers did due diligence last year. Garrett felt cold certainty settle in his gut. I think he's using your supply chain for something else. Like what? Helen asked. Garrett looked at her without flinching. I don't know yet. But 8 employees saw something they shouldn't have. And 8 employees are gone. Margaret's hands trembled slightly. She folded them on the table, forced them still. What do you need? She asked. Access to everything, full shipping records, employee files, security footage from the distribution center. You'll have it by tomorrow. Garrett nodded, started to stand. Mr. Morrison, Margaret said, if you're right about this, if Harlow is using Meridian for something illegal, we're not just talking about safety protocols anymore. I know. This could destroy the company, 1,500 employees, their families. Garrett held her gaze. Or it could save them. He left with Titan, walked to his truck, sat behind the wheel for a long moment. Sarah's voice in his head, clear as if she were sitting beside him. Do the right thing, Garrett, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I'm trying, he whispered. God help me. I'm trying. 3 days later, Garrett had his answer. He'd spent 72 hours going through records, comparing timestamps, following digital breadcrumbs. The red flag deliveries always originated from a warehouse in Idaho, just outside Boise, owned by Harlow Logistics but operated under a subsidiary name. The trucks made stops at remote Meridian locations, always at night, always with minimal staff. And here's what made Garrett's blood run cold. The delivery weights didn't match the manifests. Trucks left Idaho carrying 8,000 pounds, arrived at Meridian locations having offloaded 12,000 pounds. The math didn't work unless they were picking something up along the way. Or someone. Garrett called Officer Sarah Davies, the cop from the diner incident, asked if she knew anyone in the FBI. Why, well, Sarah asked. Because I think I found a human trafficking operation using restaurant supply chains as cover. Silence on the line. Then I'll make a call. 2 hours later, Garrett sat in a federal building in downtown Portland with Special Agent Rebecca Chen. Mid-40s, sharp suit, sharper eyes. He laid out everything. The shipping logs, the employee departures, the weight discrepancies, the subsidiary company in Idaho. Agent Chen listened without interrupting, took notes in neat handwriting. When Garrett finished, she sat back. We've been investigating Harlow for 9 months, she said. We know he's moving people. We don't know how. You just gave us the how. What happens now? Now we build a case, but we need evidence, real evidence, not just shipping weights and coincidences. What kind of evidence? Agent Chen looked at him. The kind that requires someone on the inside. Garrett understood immediately. No, absolutely not. Mr. Morrison. Grace Sullivan is 22 years old. She's a civilian. The answer is no. She's also the only person who can access those warehouses without raising suspicion. Harlow knows her. Trusts her mother's company. Garrett stood. Find another way. He walked out. Titan followed. In the parking garage, Garrett leaned against his truck, breathing hard, hands shaking. His phone rang. Margaret Sullivan. Grace told me what the FBI asked, Margaret said without preamble. She's not doing it. That's her decision, Mr. Morrison, not yours. It's too dangerous. She's stronger than you think. Garrett closed his eyes. If something happens to her, then we'll carry that weight together, Margaret said quietly. But you can't protect her from the world. You can only give her the tools to protect herself. The line went quiet. She wants to meet with you, Margaret finally said. Tomorrow. Will you at least listen? Garrett exhaled. Yeah, I'll listen. They met at the same coffee shop. Early morning, before the rush. Grace Sullivan sat across from Garrett with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. She looked different than she had at the diner. Hair pulled back, minimal makeup, dressed simply in jeans and a sweater. But her eyes were the same, blue, determined. I know what you're going to say, Grace began. Then you know my answer. Please just listen. Garrett nodded. Grace took a breath. When you stepped in at the diner, I was terrified. Not just of Blake Harlow, of everything, of being weak, of not mattering, of living my whole life protected by my mother's money and never knowing if I was actually capable of anything. She looked down at her tea. Then you stood up, and Titan stood up, and I realized something. Courage isn't not being afraid. It's acting anyway. This isn't the same thing, Garrett said. Isn't it? Grace found him in the crowd of her thoughts. 23 women. That's how many the FBI thinks Harlow has trafficked in the past 3 years. 23 women who were somebody's daughter, somebody's sister. Her voice cracked. If I can help stop that, if I can do something that actually matters, then I have to try. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Your father, he said finally. What would he think about this? Grace blinked. I never knew my father. He left when I was 3. Then what would Sarah think? Garrett's voice was rough. My wife, she died 2 years ago. And before she did, she made me promise I'd keep living, that I'd find purpose again, that I wouldn't waste the time she didn't get. He leaned forward. Every day I try to honor that promise. But Grace, she wouldn't want me to help you walk into danger. Yes, she would, Grace said softly. If it meant saving 23 other women who wanted to live just as much as she did. Garrett sat back, felt the truth of it. If you do this, he said, you follow every instruction. Everything the FBI says. Everything I say. No improvising. No heroics. Grace nodded. And Titan and I will be close. Always. You won't see us, but we'll be there. Okay. Garrett pulled out his phone, called Agent Chen, put her on speaker. She'll do it, he said, but I have conditions. They spent the next 4 days planning. Agent Chen wanted Grace to visit the Idaho warehouse. Take a tour as part of her role with Meridian, wear a wire, document everything. Garrett insisted on backup, multiple teams, surveillance on every exit, and he would be inside before Grace arrived. Hidden, just in case. They fitted Grace with a wire camera built into a small lapel pin, tested it a dozen times, taught her hand signals, escape routes, what to do if things went wrong. Garrett trained her personally, 4 hours a day, basic self-defense, situational awareness, how to stay calm when your heart was trying to break through your ribs. Grace was a quick study, focused, determined. On the third day, while practicing defensive movements, she landed an elbow strike that actually made Garrett step back. Good, he said, again. They practiced until Grace's arms shook, until she could barely stand, until the movements became muscle memory. On the fourth night, they sat outside the training facility, Grace breathing hard, Garrett handing her water. I'm scared, Grace admitted. Good, fear keeps you sharp. What if I freeze? Garrett looked at her. You won't. How do you know? Because when it mattered at the diner, you didn't run. You stayed. You tried to protect Titan even though you were terrified. He paused. That's not something you learn. That's who you are. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She blinked them back. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet. We haven't done anything. That night, Garrett sat in his apartment with Titan. The dog rested his head on Garrett's knee, grounding him. He thought about Idaho, the warehouse, Grace walking into danger. He thought about the roadside 5 years ago, how Titan had appeared from the darkness, how the bound had walked over to the ditch where Garrett sat broken and ready to die, how Titan had simply laid down beside him in the dirt and gravel, how Garrett had reached out with a shaking hand, how Titan hadn't flinched, how they'd sat there together until the sun came up, two damaged creatures choosing not to be alone. Garrett ran his hand through Titan's fur now, felt the warmth, the life. Tomorrow's going to be bad, boy, he said quietly. I can feel it. Titan's breathing stayed steady, trusting. Yeah, Garrett whispered. I know. We've been through worse. His phone buzzed. Text from Margaret Sullivan. Whatever happens tomorrow, thank you for giving my daughter a chance to be brave. Garrett typed back, she was already brave. I'm just trying to keep her alive. Margaret's response came immediately. So am I. Garrett set down the phone, looked at Titan. The dog's amber eyes were calm, patient, the eyes that had seen Garrett at his worst and stayed anyway. We're going to get her out, Garrett said. Whatever it takes. Titan pressed closer, a promise without words. Outside Portland slept, unaware that tomorrow everything would change. In Idaho, in a warehouse marked with corporate logos and false paperwork, Dominic Harlow made a phone call. The Sullivan girl is coming tomorrow, he said. Make sure she gets the full tour. I want to know what she knows. On the other end, his son Blake's voice. And if she knows too much. Dominic was quiet for a moment. Then handle it. The line went dead. Morning came too fast. Garrett woke at 4 a.m. Couldn't sleep anymore. His shoulder ached from old injuries. His hearing aid whined softly in his right ear. He fed Titan, made coffee, checked his gear one more time. Backup weapon, tactical knife, phone with GPS tracker, emergency signal device linked to Agent Chen. Everything he'd need if this went sideways. And it would go sideways. Garrett could feel it in his bones, the same way he'd felt IEDs before they detonated, the same way he'd known, walking into rooms in Ramadi, that someone wasn't walking out. He looked at Titan. The dog watched him with those knowing eyes. Stay close today, Garrett said. I'm going to need you. Titan's whole body relaxed with recognition. A mission, purpose, the things that made sense when nothing else did. Garrett grabbed his keys, headed for Idaho, and prayed he wasn't leading Grace Sullivan to her death. The Idaho warehouse sat 40 miles outside Boise, industrial district, chain-link fences, buildings that looked the same whether they were storing furniture or secrets. Harlow Logistics occupied a gray concrete structure at the end of a service road. No windows on the ground floor, loading docks on 3 sides, security cameras every 20 feet. The kind of place where things happened that nobody talked about. Garrett Morrison arrived at 4:30 in the morning, 3 hours before Grace was scheduled to show up. Darkness still held the sky, though the eastern horizon was beginning to bruise with light. He parked his truck 2 blocks away, behind an abandoned gas station. Checked his phone one last time. Text from Agent Chen. Team's in position. You're clear to proceed. Garrett looked at Titan in the passenger seat. Stay, he said quietly. Titan's ears flattened. A soft whine escaped his throat. He didn't like being left behind. Hadn't liked it in Iraq, didn't like it now. Garrett cupped the dog's face in both hands. I know, boy, but I need you safe. I need you ready in case this goes sideways. Titan licked his hand once, settled into the seat with obvious reluctance. Garrett grabbed his pack, locked the truck, moved toward the warehouse. He'd done this before. Different country, different war. Same principle. Infiltrate, observe, extract. The perimeter fence was 12 feet, topped with razor wire. But Garrett had studied the satellite images, knew there was a drainage culvert on the north side where runoff from the loading docks created a gap. He found it in the darkness, squeezed through, came up inside the compound. 2 guard stations, both manned. Garrett watched their patrol patterns for 15 minutes, timed the gaps, moved during the transition. The loading dock on the east side had a faulty door, left unlocked because the electronic lock had been broken for weeks. Corporate maintenance hadn't gotten around to fixing it. Garrett knew this because Marcus O'Brien had the same model at his diner, same manufacturer, same defect. He slipped inside. The warehouse interior was vast. 40-foot ceilings, rows of storage racks stretching into darkness, forklifts parked in neat lines, the smell of cardboard and motor oil. Garrett moved through the shadows, found a catwalk 20 feet up that ran the length of the building, climbed the metal stairs quietly, positioned himself with a clear view of the main floor and the office complex at the far end. Then he waited. Waiting was something SEALs learned early. You could spend 16 hours waiting for a 4-minute mission. The waiting was harder than the fighting. The waiting was where doubts grew. Garrett thought about Grace, 22 years old, about to walk into a building owned by a man who trafficked human beings for profit. He thought about Sarah, how she'd been brave every single day of her illness, how she'd smiled even when the pain was unbearable, how she'd made him promise to keep fighting. He thought about the gun on that Idaho roadside, the weight of it, the relief he'd felt knowing it would all be over soon. And he thought about Titan, how the dog had appeared that night, how Garrett had been sitting in the roadside ditch gun in his lap waiting for courage he couldn't find, how he'd looked up and seen amber eyes watching him from the darkness, how Titan had limped over ribs showing fur matted with blood and dirt, how the dog had simply laid down beside him in that ditch. 2 broken things choosing not to die alone. How Garrett had reached out, how Titan hadn't flinched, how they'd sat there together until the sun came up and Garrett realized he couldn't pull the trigger with a witness who trusted him. His phone buzzed. Text from Grace, 10 minutes out. Garrett's jaw tightened. He checked his backup weapon, made sure the FBI's panic signal worked, settled into position. Below the warehouse came to life. Workers arrived. Forklifts started moving. The day shift beginning like any other day. Except today wasn't any other day. At 7:45, a black Mercedes pulled into the lot. Dominic Harlow emerged from the back seat, 61 years old, silver hair perfectly styled, charcoal suit that probably cost more than Garrett made in a month. He moved like a man who'd never been told no in his life. Blake Harlow got out from the driver's side, 33, wearing a vest and dress pants, expensive watch, the kind of son who'd been handed everything and learned nothing. They walked into the building together, disappeared into the office complex. At exactly 8 a.m., Grace's rental car pulled into the lot. Garrett's heart rate spiked. He forced it down, controlled breathing, 4 counts in, hold 4, 4 counts out. Grace emerged from the car. She wore business casual, dark slacks, white blouse, hair pulled back in a professional bun. She looked older than 22, composed. The wire camera was invisible in her lapel pin. She walked toward the entrance with steady steps. Garrett watched her go, every instinct screaming to follow, to protect. He stayed put, trusted the plan, trusted Agent Chen's people positioned around the perimeter, trusted Grace. Through the office windows, Garrett could see the greeting. Dominic's smile, handshake, Blake standing behind his father like a shadow. Grace disappeared inside. The tour began. Garrett couldn't hear the conversation from his position, but he could see them moving through the office complex. Dominic gesturing, Grace nodding, playing her part perfectly. They emerged onto the warehouse floor 30 minutes later. Now Garrett could hear them, voices echoing in the cavernous space. As you can see, Miss Sullivan, we run a very efficient operation. Dominic's voice was smooth, cultured. Your mother's trust in Harlow Logistics is well placed. It's impressive, Grace replied, her voice steady. How many deliveries do you handle daily? Approximately 200 across our network. Meridian represents about 30% of our business. They walked between storage racks. Blake followed. Two security guards trailed at a distance. I noticed some deliveries are flagged differently in our system, Grace said. Red flags, late-night deliveries, different protocols. Garrett tensed. That was off script, too direct. Dominic stopped walking, turned to face Grace. You're very observant, Miss Sullivan. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Those are specialty items, temperature-sensitive materials. They require after-hours delivery to ensure quality. What kind of materials? Proprietary suppliers, confidential agreements. Dominic's tone remained pleasant, but something had shifted. I'm sure you understand. Business secrets. Grace nodded. Of course. They continued walking. But Garrett noticed Blake had moved closer to Grace, blocking her exit path. His hand moved to his phone, ready to signal Agent Chen. Not yet. Wait. They reached the back of the warehouse, a section separated by heavy plastic curtains, industrial refrigeration units, loading dock beyond. This is our cold storage, Dominic explained, for perishables awaiting distribution. He pulled back the curtain. Grace stepped through, then stopped. Garrett saw her body language change. Shoulders tense, step falter. He shifted position on the catwalk, got a better angle. Through the plastic curtain in the refrigerated section, he saw them. Not perishables, shipping containers, modified, with ventilation, locks on the outside. And through the narrow ventilation slits, Garrett saw movement. Eyes, hands pressed against metal. People. Grace's hand moved to her lapel, adjusting the pin, making sure the camera captured everything. As you can see, Dominic continued, his voice never changing tone. We maintain optimal temperature for delicate inventory. How many units do you have in storage currently? Grace asked. Her voice almost didn't shake. 9 awaiting transport tonight. 9 containers. Garrett's blood ran cold. 9 containers that weren't filled with food. Grace turned to leave. Blake blocked her path. Blake said conversationally, you ask a lot of questions for a tour. I'm thorough, Grace replied. Blake reached out, touched her lapel pin. That's a nice pin. My sister has one similar. His fingers closed around it, pulled. The pin came off in his hand. For a frozen moment, nobody moved. Blake looked at the pin, turned it over, saw the tiny camera lens. His face went dark. Dad, he said quietly, I think we have a problem. Dominic's pleasant expression evaporated, replaced by something cold, ancient. The face of a man who'd done terrible things and slept fine. Miss Sullivan, Dominic said softly, I'm very disappointed. Grace stepped back. I don't know what you're talking about. Blake grabbed her arm. Don't lie. You're wearing a wire. He shoved her against the shipping container. Hard. Grace's head bounced off metal with a sound that made Garrett's vision narrow. That was enough. But before Garrett could move, Blake was patting down Grace, found the wire taped to her ribs, ripped it off. FBI, Blake said. Dad, she's working with the FBI. Dominic pulled out his phone, shut it down, burned the documentation, moved the units to the secondary location. Now, workers scattered, forklifts started moving toward the containers. Blake pulled out a gun, pressed it against Grace's temple. You stupid little bitch, he hissed. You just killed yourself. Then chaos erupted. Grace, a voice screamed from inside the nearest container. Blake's head snapped toward the sound. In his rage and his focus on Grace, he'd forgotten to check the containers. Forgotten that 9 terrified women had heard everything. One container door swung open. A woman stumbled, Bob, early 20s, bruised, terrified, but free. Then another door, another woman. Blake realized his mistake too late. No, get back in there. But they kept coming. 9 women, different ages, different countries, all running in different directions. The warehouse descended into pandemonium. Women screaming, guards shouting, forklifts stopping mid-motion as drivers tried to figure out what was happening. Blake turned back to Grace. She was gone, disappeared into the chaos. Fuck, Blake grabbed his radio. Lock all exits, nobody leaves. Outside FB. I breached teams heard the screaming, heard the case. Agent Chen gave the order. Go now, go! Garrett dropped from the catwalk, 20 feet, landed in a crouch behind a forklift. Pain shot through his knees, but he ignored it. He came up behind the nearest guard, wrapped his arm around the man's throat, applied pressure to the carotid. The guard went limp in 8 seconds. Garrett lowered him quietly. The second guard turned, saw Garrett, reached for his weapon. Garrett was faster, closed the distance, disarmed him with a wrist lock that made bones crack. The guard screamed, dropped. Blake heard it, spun around, saw Garrett. Recognition flashed across his face. The diner, the old man who'd broken his nose. You, Blake snarled. He shifted his gun from the crowd to Garrett. That was his mistake. Garrett moved, not away, toward, closed the 10 feet between them before Blake could adjust his aim. Grabbed Blake's gun hand, twisted. The weapon discharged once bullet sparking off concrete. Garrett drove his knee into Blake's solar plexus. Blake's breath exploded out. Garrett followed with an elbow to the jaw. Blake's head snapped back. The gun clattered to the floor. Blake threw a wild punch. Garrett blocked it, countered with a throat strike that made Blake gag. Blake grabbed a wrench from a nearby workbench. Swung with desperate strength. Garrett ducked. The wrench whistled past his ear. He stepped inside Blake's guard, drove his fist into Blake's ribs. Once. Twice. Felt something crack. Blake stumbled backward. Fell. Didn't get up. FBI, nobody move. The shout came from every direction at once. Breach teams flooding through loading docks, front entrance, side doors, agents in tactical gear. Weapons drawn, voices overlapping. On the ground, hands where we can see them. Workers dropped, hands up. The smart ones, anyway. One guard tried to run, took 3 steps before a taser dropped him. Garrett raised his hands. I'm Morrison. I'm with Chen. An agent grabbed him, patted him down, confirmed his ID. Let him go. Where's Harlow? The agent demanded. Office, back section. 4 agents moved past him. Garrett followed. The 9 women who'd escaped the containers were being gathered by female agents, wrapped in emergency blankets, speaking rapidly in different languages. Crying, safe. Garrett scanned the warehouse, looking for Grace. Found her near the loading dock, sitting on the ground. A paramedic checking her head. She was alive, conscious. Their gazes locked across the warehouse. Grace smiled shakily. Mouth, thank you. Garrett nodded. Felt something in his chest unclench. He turned toward the office complex. Found the agents surrounding Dominic Harlow's private office. Inside, Dominic sat at his desk, calmly feeding papers into an industrial shredder. He didn't look up when they entered. Dominic Harlow, you're under arrest. Dominic smiled, hit a button under his desk. The shredder's motor whined. Smoke began to curl from the machine. You'll need those documents, Dominic said pleasantly. Unfortunately, there seems to be a malfunction. An agent yanked the power cord. Too late. The shredder had eaten most of the papers. Doesn't matter, Agent Chen said, entering the room. We have the containers. We have 9 victims. We have your ledgers from the servers we seized last night while you were sleeping. Dominic's smile finally faltered. You have nothing that will stand up in court. We have 9 women you were transporting across state lines. We have shipping manifests showing weight discrepancies for 3 years. We have financial records linking you to shell companies in 6 states. Agent Chen stepped closer. And we have your son, who's currently crying for his lawyer while a medic sets his ribs. She pulled out handcuffs. Dominic Harlow, you're under arrest for human trafficking, conspiracy racketeering, and about 40 other charges my team is still counting. 2 agents grabbed Dominic's arms, turned him around, cuffed him. As they let him out, Dominic looked at Garrett. I know you, Dominic said, the seal from the diner. Garrett said nothing. You think you've won something here? Dominic's voice was cold. You've destroyed nothing. There are a dozen men like me, 100 operations like this. You saved 9 girls today. There are thousands more. Yeah, Garrett said quietly, but those 9 girls, they're going home, and you're going to die in a cell. I'll take that win. Dominic's face twisted. That dog of yours, Titan. I gave the order. Blake was supposed to kill it. Garrett stepped forward. Agents moved to intercept. Mr. Morrison, Agent Chen warned. Garrett stopped, forced his hands to unclench. You're not worth it, he said to Dominic. You're not worth another second of my time. They took Dominic away. Garrett walked outside. The parking lot was full of federal vehicles, ambulances, local police, news helicopters circling overhead. He found his truck 2 blocks away. Titan was exactly where he'd left him. The dog's tail started wagging the moment he saw Garrett. Garrett climbed in. Titan immediately pressed against him, whining, checking for injuries with his nose. I'm okay, boy, I'm okay. He sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, breathing. Margaret Sullivan's car pulled up beside him. She jumped out before it fully stopped, ran toward the ambulance where Grace sat. Mother and daughter embraced, held each other like they'd never let go. Over Grace's shoulder, Margaret looked at Garrett, mouthed the words, thank you. Garrett nodded, started his truck, drove back to Portland with Titan's head on his lap. Watched the sun rise over mountains that didn't care about human trafficking or courage or any of it. The world kept turning, whether you saved it or not. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Federal courthouse in Portland. Media circus outside. Inside, quiet testimony from 9 women who'd been treated like cargo. Garrett attended every day, sat in the back, listened. Grace testified for 4 hours, walked the jury through everything. The tour, the containers, the moment Blake grabbed her, the chaos when the women escaped. She didn't cry, didn't waver, just told the truth. Blake Harlow took a plea deal, 28 years federal prison, gave up his father in exchange for avoiding life without parole. Dominic Harlow went to trial, arrogant until the end. His lawyers argued reasonable doubt, claimed he'd been deceived by subordinates, that he ran a legitimate business. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes, guilty on all 47 counts. The judge gave him 45 years federal prison. No parole. Dominic was 61. He'd die inside. As they led him away, Dominic looked at the gallery, found Garrett in the back row. Their gazes locked. Dominic's face showed nothing. No remorse, no fear, just cold calculation. Then he was gone. Grace turned in her seat, found Garrett, smiled. Outside the courthouse, Margaret held a press conference, announced that Meridian Diners was restructuring its entire supply chain, implementing new safety protocols across all locations, creating a fund for trafficking survivors. She announced the formation of the Morrison Sullivan Foundation, named after Sarah Morrison and the partnership that had brought down a trafficking network. Garrett stood at the back of the crowd, didn't want the attention, didn't need it. A reporter spotted him anyway. "Mr. Morrison, how does it feel to be a hero?" Garrett looked at the camera, at the reporter, at the crowd. "I'm not a hero," he said quietly. "I'm just a guy who showed up when it mattered." He walked away before they could ask more questions. 14 months later, the Morrison Sullivan Foundation opened its doors in a renovated warehouse in Southeast Portland, the same warehouse district where the investigation had begun, now transformed into something hopeful. 2 floors, counseling rooms, job training facilities, medical clinic, legal aid offices, housing assistance, everything a trafficking survivor might need to rebuild a life. The grand opening drew 300 people, survivors, donors, politicians who wanted to be seen doing good. Garrett stood near the back with Titan at his side. The dog was 9 years old now, more gray in his muzzle, slower on stairs, but his eyes were still clear, still watching. Grace worked the crowd with practiced ease, no longer the uncertain girl from the diner, now the foundation's director of operations, confident, capable, still kind. She found Garrett during a quiet moment. "You should be up there," she said, gesturing to the stage where Margaret was about to speak. "This is your foundation too. It's not about me." "Yes, it is. It's about all of us, everyone who refused to look away." Margaret's speech was short, focused on the work ahead, the lives they'd help rebuild. Then she did something Garrett hadn't expected. "There's someone here today who doesn't like attention, who'll probably be mad at me for this." Margaret smiled. "But I'm going to embarrass him anyway." She looked directly at Garrett. "Garrett Morrison is a former Navy SEAL who could have walked past danger, who could have looked away when my daughter needed help, who could have done the safe thing, the easy thing, the thing that wouldn't risk his job or his life." The crowd turned to look at him. Garrett's face flushed. Instead, he stood up, and in standing up, he showed us all what courage looks like. Not fearless, not perfect, just present. Margaret gestured to the wall behind her, a large plaque. The Sarah Morrison Memorial Hall, named for the woman who taught Garrett that life is worth fighting for, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. They unveiled the plaque. Beneath it, a photograph. Sarah Morrison, red hair, freckles, smiling like the world was good. Garrett's vision blurred. He blinked hard. Titan pressed closer, reassuring. After the ceremony, Garrett stood alone in Sarah's memorial hall, looking at her photograph. "I did it, Sarah," he whispered. "I kept living. I found purpose. Like you asked." He felt a presence beside him. Margaret. "She was beautiful," Margaret said quietly. "Yeah, she was." "Would she be proud?" Garrett thought about it, really thought. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think she would." Margaret touched his shoulder briefly, then left him alone with his memories. That evening, Garrett took Titan for a walk through Portland's waterfront park. Sunset painted the river gold and orange. Families played. Joggers passed, life happening all around them. Titan moved slower now, but steady, still strong where it mattered. They found a bench, sat, watched the river. Garrett pulled out his wallet, the photograph of Sarah he'd carried for 3 years, looked at it in the fading light. I miss you, he said. Every day. But I'm okay now. We're okay. He put the photograph away, pulled out his phone instead. Scrolled through messages. One from Grace. Thank you for everything. We're changing lives because you changed ours. One from Marcus O'Brien. New panic buttons working great. Haven't needed them yet, thanks to you. One from Helen Montgomery. 47 locations. 0 incidents last quarter. First time in 5 years. Small victories. Quiet ones. The kind that didn't make headlines but changed everything for the people who lived them. Garrett looked down at Titan. We did good, boy. Sarah would be proud. Titan's whole body relaxed with recognition. The sun dropped below the horizon. Portland's lights began to glow. The city breathing. Alive. Garrett stood. Come on, let's go home. They walked together through the park, man and dog. Both scarred, both surviving, both still fighting. Because that's what you did when you'd been given a second chance. You fought for it every day, in small ways and big ones. You showed up when it mattered, and you didn't look away. 2 years after that. Garrett Morrison, 40 years old, stood in the Foundation's training room, teaching a class of 20 veterans, men and women who'd served, who'd come home broken, who needed purpose. The job isn't about being a hero, he told them. It's about being present, about seeing danger before it becomes tragedy, about standing between the vulnerable and the people who'd hurt them. Titan lay at the front of the room, 11 years old now, mostly gray, arthritis in his hips, but still alert during classes, still teaching by example. After the class, one of the students approached. Young woman, Marine Corps veteran, Purple Heart. Mr. Morrison, I wanted to thank you for this program, for the opportunity. You earned it, Garrett said, same as everyone here. Can I ask you something? Sure. Does it get easier? The guilt, the nightmares, the feeling like you left part of yourself overseas. Garrett was quiet for a moment. No, he said honestly. It doesn't get easier, but it gets different. You learn to carry it, and you find people who help you carry it. He looked at Titan, and sometimes if you're lucky, they find you. The woman nodded, understood. That night, Garrett came home to his apartment. Not the old place, a better one. 2 bedrooms, ground floor with a small yard for Titan. He made dinner, simple. Pasta, sauce from a jar, salad. Ate at the kitchen table. Titan lying nearby, breathing slow and even. His phone rang. Grace. Hey, Garrett, just checking in. I'm good. How's D.C.? Grace had taken a position with a congressional committee, advocating for anti-trafficking legislation, making noise in rooms that needed disrupting. Exhausting. Necessary, she paused. Mom wants to know if you're coming for Thanksgiving. I don't know. Please come. It's been 2 years since we've all been together. Garrett looked at Titan. The drive is hard on him now. We'll fly you both out. First class. Titan gets his own seat. Despite himself, Garrett smiled. I'll think about it. That's a yes in Garrett speak. I'll tell Mom. After he hung up, Garrett sat on the floor next to Titan. The dog lifted his head, rested it on Garrett's lap. You getting soft on me, old man, Garrett said quietly. Titan's ears perked forward. Yeah, me too. 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning in February, Titan didn't get up for breakfast. Garrett knew immediately. He called the vet. Emergency appointment. Drove carefully. Titan lying on the back seat, breathing shallow. The vet examined him gently. Old, kind. He'd been treating Titan for years. His heart is failing, the vet said quietly. I can try emergency intervention, but Mr. Morrison, he's in pain. He's tired. Garrett sat on the floor of the exam room, gathered Titan in his arms. The dog looked at him with those amber eyes, still clear, still trusting. It's okay, boy, Garrett whispered. You did so good. You saved me. You saved so many people. Titan licked his hand weakly. I love you. I'll never forget you. And I promise I'll keep going. I promise. Images flashed through Garrett's mind. Idaho roadside. Titan limping out of the ditch in darkness. Choosing him when he'd been ready to die. The diner. Titan's growl. The warning that saved Grace. The warehouse. Titan waiting in the truck. Trusting Garrett to come back. 1,000 quiet mornings. Titan's head on his knee. The weight that kept him anchored to the world. Sarah's funeral. Titan lying beside the grave. Silent guard who understood grief. Every nightmare. Titan's breathing pulling him back from the edge. Every panic attack. Titan's presence grounding him. Every moment he'd wanted to give up, Titan refusing to let him. You saved me, Garrett whispered against Titan's fur. Every single day, you saved me. The vet prepared the injection. Garrett held Titan close. Felt the dog's heart beating against his chest, felt it slow, felt it stop. And then Titan was gone. Garrett sat there holding him for an hour, maybe more. The vet didn't rush him. When he finally stood, his legs were numb, his face wet with tears. He didn't remember crying. We'll take care of him, the vet said gently. You can pick up the ashes next week. Garrett nodded, couldn't speak. He drove home in silence. The truck felt empty, wrong. His phone was full of messages when he got back. Grace, Margaret, Helen, Marcus. They'd all heard somehow. The veteran community was small. News traveled. He didn't answer any of them. Just sat in his apartment, in the quiet, missing the sound of Titan's breathing. The funeral was small, private. They buried Titan's ashes at the foundation. In the garden they'd planted out back. Sarah's memorial plaque nearby. Grace spoke. Margaret spoke. 20 veterans who'd been trained by Garrett came, stood in silence. They'd all known Titan, the dog who sat quietly in classes, who sensed when someone was struggling, who provided comfort without judgment. Garrett didn't speak, couldn't, just stood there with his arms folded tight across his chest, watching them lower the small urn into the ground. A Marine played taps, the notes carried across the garden, sharp and clear and final. When it was over, everyone left except Grace. She stood beside Garrett, didn't say anything, just stood there. I don't know how to do this without him, Garrett finally said. Yes, you do, Grace replied quietly. He taught you how. Garrett looked at her. By showing up, by staying, by refusing to give up even when it was hard. Grace's voice was gentle. That's what Titan did for you, and now you do it for others. Garrett nodded, still couldn't speak. Grace hugged him, tight, sisterly, then left him alone. Garrett stood in the garden as the sun set, looking at the fresh earth, the small marker they'd placed. Titan 2017 to 2028. He saved more lives than we'll ever know, good boy. Best boy. Below that they'd added a quote, Garrett's choice. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends, John 15 to 13. Garrett whispered, thank you, Titan, for everything, for saving my life, for giving me a reason to keep going. The wind rustled through the garden, gentle. Like an answer, Garrett walked home. Alone for the first time in 11 years, but not quite alone, because Titan had taught him something, something that would stay with him forever. You don't need to be fearless to be brave. You don't need to be perfect to matter. You just need to show up, when it counts, for the people who need you, and that's exactly what Garrett Morrison did, every single day, for the rest of his life. Epilogue, 10 years after the Morrison-Sullivan Foundation now operated in 12 states. 423 trafficking survivors helped, 87 veterans trained and employed, safety protocols implemented across 16 restaurant chains that became industry standard. Margaret Sullivan, 68 years old, had stepped down as Meridian CEO, passed the company to Grace, spent her time now at the foundation, mentoring survivors. Sharing her own story of almost losing her daughter, she'd learned something in those 10 years. That power meant nothing if you didn't use it to protect the powerless. Grace Sullivan Morrison, 32, ran both the foundation and Meridian's ethics division. She'd married a federal prosecutor she met during the Harlow trial, had twin daughters, named one of them Sarah. She taught her children about a dog named Titan, about a man named Garrett who'd stood up when everyone else sat down, about courage being action despite fear. Garrett Morrison, 48 years old, still woke up some mornings expecting to hear Titan's breathing, still reached down beside the bed before remembering. But he didn't wake up wanting to die anymore. He woke up with purpose, with people who needed him, with a legacy that mattered. In the foundation garden, Titan's marker had been joined by Sarah's, side by side. Two souls who taught Garrett that love didn't end when breathing stopped. It just changed form, became legacy, became purpose, became the reason you kept going when everything hurt. Garrett visited every Sunday, sat on the bench between them, talked to Sarah, talked to Titan, told them about the lives saved, the battles won, the quiet victories that didn't make headlines but changed everything. We're doing good work, he'd say. I hope you're proud. And in the rustling of leaves, in the warmth of sunlight, in the peace that finally settled in his chest after so many years of war, Garrett Morrison believed they were. That they were watching, that they were proud, that love didn't end, it just waited, patient, eternal, until the day he'd see them again. Garrett stood, straightened his jacket, walked back to work. Because that's what you did when you'd been saved. You spent the rest of your life saving others, one person at a time, until the darkness couldn't hold, until the silence broke, until everyone knew that one voice, one action, one moment of courage could change everything. Titan had taught him that, Sarah had believed it, and Garrett Morrison would spend the rest of his life proving them right.